Okay, well, before we begin, I would just like to state for the record that today is October 20th, 2021, and my name is Ben Bauman, and I'm here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm speaking via phone with Vi Simpson, who is in Bloomington, Indiana, and we are doing an interview for the Indiana Legislative Oral History Initiative. So just starting off, when and where were you born?
I was born in Los Angeles, California in March of 1946. Okay.
And what were your parents' names?
My father's name was Lloyd Sentman, Sentman. My mother's name was Elena Maria Chacon, and then Sentman. She went by Helen.
Okay, interesting. How did your family get to Indiana?
My family didn't come to Indiana. I was raised in California. I moved to Indiana in 1978.
Oh, okay. And what was the reason?
They followed me to Indiana.
Okay.
I would prefer not to talk about how I got to Indiana.
Sure.
But
that's totally fine. Yeah, whatever, up to you. So
I chose, let me put it this way, I chose to live in Indiana.
Okay.
And to leave California.
Got it. Okay. What were your parents' occupations?
My mother, well, let me start with my dad, who was a professional meat cutter and a member of the Meat Cutters Labor Union, which no longer exists. It's part of the food, what are they called? The Commercial Food Workers Union or whatever it is. They got absorbed into that. But at the time, there was a separate Meat Cutters Union, and he belonged to that. My mother was a housewife, homemaker, but also a foster parent. My parents were foster parents, and so she, most of my life growing up, there were infants, either orphaned or deserted or neglected infants, many of whom had disabilities. Who came straight from the hospital to our home. That was my mother's specialty.
Wow.
And so sometimes we had 2 or 3 babies at a time.
Wow, okay. Did you have any siblings growing up?
I did not.
Okay. And so how would you describe your childhood overall?
I had a wonderful childhood because I had no siblings and we only had infants in the house for me to interact with.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time with adults. So I was kind of a tomboy and liked to sing and dance and do little plays and things like that, but I learned to play by myself when we moved to Castro Valley, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area on the East Bay side. I had a lot of friends who lived on the same block of the street that I lived on, so we invented all kinds of things to do, as kids did back in those days, where there was nothing electronic.
Sure.
And so we played a lot of ball in the streets and rode bikes, and I learned to drive a car when I was 12. Things like that.
Wow.
That kids today would be totally bored with, I'm sure.
Who would you say were the most influential people in your childhood?
My mother was very influential. I spent a lot of time with my mother, and both my mother and father had an interest in politics. And so we talked a lot about politics. Like I said, I spent a lot of time with grown-ups, and but my mom and dad were very important, of course, in my life. I didn't live close to other family members. My mother's family lived for the most part in New Mexico and Colorado, and so I'd see them in the summertime. My father's family was from Iowa, and I'd see them in the summertime when we'd vacation. And so I wasn't around other family members very much. So in some ways, my childhood was a little bit lonely. I probably left that part out. I felt very isolated at times because I didn't have other kids around. But I also had a couple of teachers who invested a lot of time in me and saw things in me that I didn't see in myself. I grew up in a blue-collar household, and so going to college and doing big things in my life, it didn't occur to me other than being an actress, which is what I wanted to do when I was little.
Oh, okay.
So I had a teacher in the 6th grade, Mr. Haller, who really believed in me and counted on me and put me in charge of things and encouraged me. And then I had a teacher in high school who was actually my choral director, who was very active in politics and very liberal in her political views, and she encouraged me to get involved in politics. And I started working in campaigns as a volunteer when I was in high school. I also had, on the other side of that coin, I also had a school counselor, Mr. Leaf, I'll always remember it, who, when I went to him and told him that I wanted to be a doctor, told me that girls couldn't be doctors and that if I wanted to be in the medical field, I should think about nursing. And, of course, part of that was the time, but part of that was very discouraging to me. My personality is such that it's like, oh, yeah?
Right.
That's what you think, buddy. And so I guess that was encouraging to me, more than discouraging, because I saw it as a challenge.
Yeah.
To prove him wrong.
Yeah.
Of course, I didn't become a doctor, so I guess he was right. But I would say that those adults had the most influence on me and the paths that I chose. I also had a speech and debate club and class, and that teacher saw a lot of promise in me and really encouraged me and helped me a lot in high school.
Yeah. Okay. So where did you go to college?
California State University in the San Francisco Bay Area. And
what did you study?
Well, I was a music major to begin with.
Okay.
I had a lot of majors. I kept switching.
Oh, okay. Sure.
But I finally ended up with mostly music. I finished a music minor and switched toward the end to business. So I did a lot of accounting classes and business classes.
Yeah. Okay. And how did you view your college experience overall?
It was a commuter college, and so I didn't get to live on campus.
Okay.
I didn't do any Greek stuff. I was as active as you could be in a commuter setting, but I also had to work because my parents couldn't afford college for me, and so I had a fairly intensive work schedule. I did discover, and I should have said this about high school, I did discover that I was a good writer, And so right out of college, I did some newspaper writing and became a journalist. And so I covered. I worked for a weekly newspaper in the South Bay, and that was a very diverse population. A lot of Spanish speakers, and I covered everything. I covered sports, I covered theater, I covered, but mostly I covered politics and really developed my love of government and politics at that time.
Oh, okay.
And I discovered that I couldn't be a very good journalist because I was way too biased. And it was very difficult for me to cover politics. So at one point I became a communications person for a U.S. Senate candidate, and that kind of led me in a whole different direction.
Okay. And so how did your sort of political developments change after college and when you started working as a journalist? And
well, I was very active in campaigns as early as John Kennedy's campaign for president. When I was still in high school, I was on the committee for Bobby Kennedy in Alameda County. So I did a lot of things politically, a lot of volunteer work, etc. As I said, I did some communications work for George Brown when he ran. He was a congressman and ran for the U.S. Senate. He lost in the primary, so that was short-lived, but it was very meaningful to me. So a couple of things happened. The Vietnam War was very impactful for me. The civil rights movement, particularly the migrant farm workers in California, since so much of my family on my mother's side were and are Latinos and Native Americans, and often I had a lot of interaction with Latino culture.
Sure.
Growing up. So I was very active in that. But the Vietnam War was just so overwhelming. And then, as I mentioned, I worked on Bobby Kennedy's campaign. And when he was killed, and also Martin Luther King that year, 1968 was a turning point in my life for sure. I actually dropped out of politics for about a year or so. I didn't want anything to do with it. I wasn't going to vote. I wasn't, I was done. It was too heartbreaking. 1968 was just a horrible year for me.
Yeah.
For everyone. But I took it very personally. But right after that, I dropped out for a few months, I guess, maybe a year, but then jumped right back in, and it was, but always as a volunteer. I worked later in Sacramento for who later became a congressman, but he was chief of staff of the Assembly, the Democrat caucus in the Assembly in California. I worked for him, did some House campaign or Assembly campaigns, and so I was kind of going in a particular role. We were following a particular road, and then I did some lobbyist work and some writing for the California Parks and Recreation Society, which was a very large lobbying organization, association of professionals who work in parks and recreation arenas. So that was really fun, and I really enjoyed that government work. When I came to Indiana, I'm going to skip ahead here.
Sure.
When I came to Indiana, I didn't know anybody, had 2 small children, didn't have a job. So for about 6 months, I was devastated because there was a big shock to me.
Yeah.
I came to Bloomington, which was a little more integrated, a little more diverse population than other places in Indiana, but politically, culturally, it was pretty shocking, and I felt like I'd made a really big mistake.
Okay.
So I decided to, just kind of pull my pants up and figure out, act like a big girl, and try to change things for myself. So I just marched into the mayor's office in Bloomington and said it was election year in '79, a re-election year for him.
Yeah.
And I walked in there and I said, "You're going to want to hire me because I know how to do this stuff."
Yeah.
And you don't know me, but I can help you.
Yeah.
And he did.
Wow.
And so I, along with a couple of other local people, there were 3 of us who kind of co-chaired or co-managed the campaign, and it was a great experience. It was wonderful, and I figured out that these people here in Bloomington were terrific. They were great. They were well educated. They were very well-read, educated voters, that I could really find a niche for myself here, and which I did.
Yeah.
So he was reelected in 1979. That was Frank McCloskey, who later became a congressman. And then in 1980, I was working on a congressional campaign, and for the current state senator from this district, and that didn't work out very well, but because we really didn't see eye to eye on things. But Frank McCloskey called me and asked me if I would be interested in running for county auditor. And my response to that was, what the hell is a county auditor? Because in California, there weren't any county auditors.
Okay.
There was no such thing. We had controllers.
Yeah.
Which it turned out that that's very much the same. But he said county auditor. I said, I don't know what that is. And he said, don't worry, I'll teach you. And I said, well, I don't want to run if I have a primary opponent. But other than that, I think I'll do it.
Yeah.
After all, it was a full-time job, and it was politics, and
right.
got in with the Democrat Party here in Bloomington. So I thought, what's the worst that can happen? So I went down, and he said, oh, no, there's nobody else running. Nobody else is filed in the primary, so you'll just have to run in the general. So I went down and I filed, and next to the last day, perhaps, or maybe even the last day, and it turned out that 3 other people filed as well. So I did have a primary.
Oh, wow.
A huge primary. So I got my little group of friends together, and we put this whole, and including my son, who was by then, 1980, he was maybe 10, 11, something like that. I guess he was 10. And we put a strategy together, and we did a lot of door-to-door and a lot of heavy-duty campaigning, and so I won the primary. I went on to win the general election, and I was elected county auditor of Monroe County.
Wow.
In 1980. I was sworn in on January 1st, 1981.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So how did your family influence your career when you were in Indiana then? Sounds like there was some interesting things that went on with your children helping you out. And
my kids, I dragged along to everything.
Yeah.
They went to every, chicken dinner, and
Yeah.
they went out and knocked on doors with me. My son loved it.
Yeah.
Loved it. My daughter hated it. 4 years difference in their age. So
Okay.
She was younger, and she thought it was just a huge pain, but she did it, and as it has turned out, both of them are interested in politics. My son works in the political arena, and he's a lawyer in California.
Oh, okay.
And my daughter is an activist, more of an issue person than a political person, but
Sure.
But an activist for sure. So it was hard. By this time, my mom and dad had followed me to Indiana. So my dad had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
Okay.
And she needed help with his care, and
Yeah.
so we moved them here to Bloomington, Ellettsville actually, and I helped as much as I could, but she was the biggest help to me.
Yeah.
Because she was able to make sure the kids had dinner every night, even when I was out knocking on doors, that they did their homework, that they did all that they needed to do, and she made it possible. I couldn't have done it without her.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So when you started to get really involved in Indiana state politics and you started to think about running for, the Indiana General Assembly, were there any key issues or legislation that you're really interested in working on?
Yes, but I want to back up just a moment.
Go for it.
Tell you that I wasn't thinking about running for the state office.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I was a county auditor. I was doing a good job, I thought. There was a woman, Charlotte Zietlow, who had been elected the same time in 1980 as county commissioner, into a almost entirely Republican environment at the county level.
Yeah.
Monroe County used to be Republican. And so we were both elected that year, and the two of us kind of took on all of the old ways of doing things, some of the internal corruption that was going on at the courthouse.
Mm-hmm.
And so we brought in a lot of reforms. When I first ran, the voter registration files were on index cards.
Oh, wow.
There was no computer. We had no computer at the county level, so we bought a computer. We computerized the voter registration files. We computerized the property records, or started that process, which was a very long, tedious process, but we got that done. So we did a lot of reforms, and so I was cooking. I thought everything was great. Intended to run for re-election, and honestly, I don't think I would have been opposed seriously at that point.
Yeah.
Some of my duties as county auditor included participation in the County Auditors Association and the County Officials Association of Indiana Counties. And so I was on the legislative committee of both of those groups, and was very active in those groups, mostly because I wanted to learn from my colleagues, because I didn't really know very much.
Right.
At some point in my duties in the Auditors Association or the County Officials Association, we did a reception for legislators in Indianapolis. And I was there, and I met Senator Louis Mahern, and we talked for a while, and he said to me, you have any interest in running for the General Assembly? And I went, I don't think so. No. And he said, I think you ought to think about that. You'd be a good candidate. So, that was said, and I didn't give it much thought. Later, this was in 1983, I think so, 1983, toward the end of the year, I got a call from Senator Frank O'Bannon, who was the caucus leader at that point of the Democrats in the Senate, and he was recruiting. Louis Mahern had mentioned me to Frank, and I was, Bloomington at that time was about a 52-53% Republican district.
Right.
There was a Republican incumbent. And so Frank called and said, we think you'd be a great candidate, and we would like you to run. And we think we can win this seat. So I had to be convinced. I was not convinced that I could win it, but they kept after me, and I finally decided, I think about in December or January of '84, that I would run for the state Senate, which was really risky.
Okay.
Because there was a Republican incumbent in a slightly Republican district, and I was giving up a fairly safe county auditor seat. So it was risky, but being young and foolish, I decided to do it. And that summer of '84 is when I met Senator Bill McCarty.
Okay.
Who took me to lunch one day and convinced me that the caucus would be helpful, and anything I needed, the caucus would be there to help me win this race and train me on the issues and all of that. And true to his word, the caucus was very helpful. They they came down for press conferences. They really did help a lot.
Yeah.
And I was able to win.
Yeah. And so, what did your campaign emphasize?
I worked on the 2 or 3 issues that I chose to campaign on: education, supporting public schools, and higher education, of course, which included, because I have IU and Ivy Tech, both a fairly large Ivy Tech campus in this district. So education is very highly regarded here. It's a very important issue. The second was environmental issues, which in Indiana at that time were totally ignored. We didn't have a recycling program. We didn't even have a department overseeing environmental regulation. All the environmental bills, there were a handful. They would go to the health committee because there wasn't even a committee assigned to learn or take on those issues. And the environment was really rising as an issue in this area, because while I was county auditor, the EPA came into Bloomington and we had discovered and reported it to EPA that two of our landfills and one of our factories had PCB contamination.
Yikes.
And so we had some Superfund sites here that were practically in the middle of the city, and it was a huge issue, huge. Plus, Brown County, of course, was in the district, and also part of Greene County at the time, and there was a lot of timbering issues, logging issues in those communities, and as well as water. So environment was very on everybody's plate at that time. And the third issue I wanted to talk about was healthcare. That really was before it became a national issue, but healthcare, it seemed to me, was a rising issue because of the aging population, because of lack of insurance, and the high costs of pharmaceuticals and things like that. So I really jumped on that and learned as much as I could about healthcare. Sure.
So did you have a particular campaign strategy, or?
Yeah, win.
You win, yeah, that's right.
I knocked on millions of doors. I'm sure there weren't millions, but it seemed like millions.
Right.
I really believe in face-to-face conversations. I spent a lot of time knocking on doors every day, 7 days a week, rain, sleet, snow, I was there. And I also registered a lot of voters as I went, because I noticed that there were lots of people who were not registered. And because Bloomington, by comparison to other communities, is fairly transient to the university, I think. And so people would move in and out, and they'd get lost in the shuffle, and many of them were not registered to vote. So I just really worked hard and had a lot of wonderful volunteers who jumped in to help.
Yeah.
We didn't have a lot of money. We also had a good mail program. We had enough money to finance that. As I said, the caucus was very helpful in helping me raise money. I think our budget was about $36,000, which was I think the largest budget for any Senate race in the state that year.
Wow. Okay. Do you remember your opponent?
Yes. He was an incumbent, Senator Farrell Duckworth.
Oh, okay. And what was it like running against him?
Farrell was a very nice man. We lived in two neighboring townships outside of the city limits of Bloomington. I lived in Richland Township, which is Ellettsville and the surrounding area, and he lived in Van Buren Township. His wife was the Van Buren Township trustee. But the population of Van Buren and the population of Richland were almost the same at the time. And both fairly Republican townships. So it was. I tried really hard to make some inroads into Van Buren Township. It was difficult, though.
Yeah.
And Eastern Greene County, which was neighbors Van Buren Township, and it was that was really difficult. He didn't spend much time in Brown County, as I recall, and so Brown County being the same population as Van Buren and Richland, I decided I would go over there and spend a lot of effort, and which I did.
Yeah.
And it was, I had a lot of responses from people saying, gosh, we've never even seen our state senator. We don't know what it is, kind of thing. And so I think that was helpful. I had a lot of wonderful volunteers in Brown County. Brown County people are fabulous. I love Brown County.
Yeah.
So it was, It was, let me say it was polite.
Okay.
It was we weren't friends or anything, but we were respectful of one another. We had a couple of debates. I had a couple of press conferences. He made a couple of bad votes, which I was able to pounce upon, and that seemed to be enough. Later, Farrell and I got to be better friends.
Mm-hmm.
Better acquaintances, I'll put it that way. So, it was a different day then when people were cordial with one another.
Sure. What did you think of the election process?
Well, it was the hand that was dealt me,
Yeah.
It was, these are the rules, this is what you do, and so we just did it.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have time really to think about
Yeah.
it. It was fine. It worked fine. I won, so
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
fine.
I mean, looking back at it, were there kind of things that you wish were different about the election process, or was it kind of made sense to you and was pretty efficient?
No, I thought it went pretty well.
Okay.
It had much more of a local flavor. The election workers were local people that I knew from church or from school.
Yeah.
Kids were in school in Richland Township, for instance. So I had a ton of kids who were volunteers.
Okay.
Who marched in the parades and worked the polls and did all kinds of things for me. And if you buy them a hamburger and give them a T-shirt, they're more than happy to help. Plus, I had taught Sunday school for several years, so all my Sunday school kids were out there helping. So it was a very the whole campaign was very local. A lot of my best friends and people who, my friends who worked in the county auditor's office, who wanted to help, and then all these kids, friends of my sons and kids from church, and it was that kind of campaign. It was it was fun, actually. We had a lot of fun.
And so, how did you feel when you first found out that you won the election?
We were elated. It was a long evening because it was very close as the votes came in. I was behind, and my son, who was really into this stuff, in '84, he was he a freshman in high school by then? He was 14 years old, so I think he was a freshman in high school. But anyway, he had these big spreadsheets, again, not access to computers like we have now, but he made these big spreadsheets with every precinct, and he estimated somehow how many votes I needed to win by, or how many votes I could lose by and still win the election.
Wow.
Every single precinct. And when the precincts were reported, he would record it on this big spreadsheet.
Oh my gosh.
So it was about 11:30, close to midnight, and I was still behind. And Senator Duckworth, according to the newspaper reporter who was with me, he said that Senator Duckworth had just claimed victory. And did I want to concede? And my son, my 14-year-old son, comes over and says, "Don't you dare. Our precincts aren't in yet." And so I said, "Oh, no, there's still a long night to go, blah, blah, blah."
Right.
All the things that you say. And I'll be darned, within an hour, we had overtaken him and ended up winning by a couple thousand votes. So,
oh my gosh.
But so you just you never you don't concede until the last vote's counted, I guess.
Yeah, sounds like it.
So, we were ecstatic, to say the least, because we thought all night we were going to lose. Oh,
yeah.
It was close. It was close. I do have one little story.
Yeah.
About when I went to Organization Day, which is when we're sworn in. Officially, you become the state senator the day of the election, or the day after the election, by state statute, I guess.
Right.
But they do have this swearing-in ceremony. So on Organization Day. So later in November, a few weeks after the election, I get all gussied up and in my suit and my new suit, and go to the State House, and I just walked in all by myself, and I walked into the chamber, the Senate chamber, and nobody was in there. But there is back in the old days, before computerized voting, they had a big board with everybody's name on it, and then lights would light up, whether it was red or green, to record your votes. And I looked up on that board, and there was my name. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I don't know how to do this. What am I going to do? And I got really nervous all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Until that time, I was proud and excited.
Right.
But just standing in this chamber where, these giants had stood in the past.
Sure.
People who had been governors and senators and, who had stood in this chamber, and their name had been on the board. And I just thought, oh my God, I'm in way over my head. You've taken one too many risks this time, girlie. So anyway, then we come back to work. I get sworn in, and then we start our committee hearings and start filing bills and so forth. And I sat through a couple of committee hearings, and I remember thinking to myself, these guys aren't that special.
Right.
I listened to them talk. I listened to them present their bills. I listened to questions that they were asking the authors of bills, or asking lobbyists who were testifying. And it was obvious that some of them hadn't even read the bills. They had no understanding of the bill. And it was like, I think I can do this job.
Yeah.
I think I can. And for me, that was a big turning point, because I wasn't the most confident of people. Plus, there were only 4 women in the Senate. And so I was younger than most of my colleagues. I was one of the few women. And I was scared. And that realization that these people it's a citizen legislature, which means, there are realtors and teachers and farmers and construction workers. These people are just like our next door neighbors.
Right.
And I can do this job. There isn't anybody in here better than me. No one in here is worse than me. And so it really helped propel me into a place of more assertiveness, maybe some would say aggressiveness, to be a proponent for those things that I was elected to represent, and the people I was elected to represent. It was a real turning point for me when I finally was honest about the people who I was serving with. Right. And realized, yes, I can learn this job, I can do it, and I can do it well. And so I think I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that was good, yeah. So once you started to get, comfortable in the General Assembly and you started to have more elections coming up, did you change campaign strategies at all, or?
Not really. The toughest campaign I had was not the original one in '84, but the next one in '88.
Oh, okay.
My first re-election campaign in 1988, which my son and daughter were very involved in, both of them.
Yeah.
And I ran against a longtime city council member, who was very highly respected and highly regarded. He and his wife were big contributors to lots of causes in the city. So that was a very tough campaign, and I really worked hard at it and spent a lot of money, raised a lot of money and spent a lot of money. But we won it, not because that my opponent was not capable. He certainly could have served and served very well, but because we worked twice as hard, and by then I was the incumbent, right? So I had been working on a lot of issues that the community was very interested in. So I think that's why we won that one. But that was the toughest race, was in '88. Bill suggested that I talk about the difference between running for election and running for re-election.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because there is a difference psychologically.
Sure.
Because when you run the first time for an office, if you lose, you lose. It's not something you take personally. You hope you will win. When you're running for re-election, however, I always felt more pressure because it is a comment on you personally, and the job that you did.
Right.
Or are doing. And so it was, for me, it was one of those things where I'm not a good loser anyway, so I admit to it. There was no way anybody was going to beat me.
Yeah.
Because I thought I had done a good job, and damn it, I was going to make sure everyone else thought I did a good job too. And there is more pressure running for re-election, I think, than running the first time.
Yeah, sure.
At least there was for me.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So when you're in the Indiana General Assembly, you mentioned kind of, feeling a little pressure once you saw your name on the board for the first time.
Yeah.
Did you feel pretty comfortable with sort of your expectations for the legislative process? And once you started, going through the committees, did you feel like, this wasn't too complicated, or did you feel like there was a learning curve at all?
I think I had prepared my brain for it to be very complicated, and all these committee hearings and conference committees, and all the secret backroom negotiations, and how am I going to learn that? How am I going to get involved in that enough so that I can really perform?
Right.
And I was nervous about that. I don't think it was as complicated as I thought it was going to be.
Okay.
I thought it was an easier task. But I came with the mindset. Of course, I've been around legislatures in both California and Indiana from my previous work experiences. But I thought, I really came with the mindset that I'm going to do my homework. I'm going to be better prepared than anybody else on the floor or in that committee room. And that gave me the confidence, I think, to believe in myself. And so learning how it works, there's a bit of a learning curve for sure.
Yeah.
The biggest part of the curve, however, is not in what I had to learn about the process, but in what my colleagues had to learn about me.
Okay. Interesting.
Because that takes time, and you have to prove to them that you can be trusted, that your word is gold, and that when you say you're going to do something, you do it, and you take care of the little courtesies, like informing somebody ahead of time that you're going to have an amendment on their bill, or little courtesies that not everyone does, but it always seemed like the right thing to do to me.
Yeah.
I spent 28 years in the Senate. I was always in the minority, and I knew up front that serving in the minority was going to be different than serving in the majority, and that you had to depend on your colleagues across the aisle in order to have successes.
Yeah.
And so I worked very hard to build relationships, and mostly people got to know that on certain issues, I would be the most informed person in the room.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Because I worked really hard at being that.
Yeah.
There wasn't anybody doing environmental stuff, for instance, in the legislature in 1985 or 86.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah.
And I wanted to have a place that I could really delve into that was unique and that would make me stand out, which was really important when you're one of 50 people. And so I worked really hard at the environmental stuff. And that was good for me in my district, of course. So it was good politics, but it was also good policy because Indiana was so far behind in terms of its environmental policy. And so I got to the place where people on Republicans would come and ask me about an environmental issue. And I had a couple of colleagues across the aisle who would always ask me to be on their bill with them, which I suspect was to share the load of share the workload.
Yeah.
On a particular issue, particularly if it was technical in nature. So later we created a Republican and I introduced legislation to create the Department of Environmental Management, and then it got its own committee, which I served on, and because we kept trying to, there were a couple of Republicans who really got it, that this environmental stuff is going to be the wave of the future. You know, these are the issues we're going to be talking about the next decade. And so there were several of them, maybe 3-4 of them, who really got involved in some environmental issues, and really we worked together on them.
Yeah.
I'm off the track. I've forgotten your question, Neil.
No, that's okay. I mean, you've been just talking about some other things I was curious about, so that's totally fine. Actually, thinking of another question, Were there any people that you kind of thought of as political mentors when you first got into the General Assembly that kind of helped you figure things out, or?
Absolutely. I was very fortunate. I served with then Senator Julia Carson, who later became Congresswoman Carson from Indianapolis.
Yeah.
Who was helpful to me. One big disappointment I had was that the women, there were 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, I believe.
Okay.
When I was elected, they were not generally as supportive as I had hoped they would be.
Mm.
You know, they were not. They didn't share a lot of information, and it was they already had their groups, right?
Okay.
Their cliques or whatever, and so they weren't terribly welcoming. Julia, I think, was the most welcoming, but Senator Louis Mahern, Senator Mike Gary, and Senator Bill McCarty were a threesome. They were like the 3 Musketeers. They all hung together, and they kind of adopted me. I was like the little sister for them.
Yeah.
And they were incredibly helpful to me and mentored me, helped me hurdle some very large roadblocks occasionally.
Okay.
Mistakes that I probably would have made if it hadn't been for their advice. The best advice I got, when I first got there, I asked for the education committee because, I had campaigned on education issues. My district was very pro-education.
Sure.
I wanted the education committee. A few months into it, Senator Gary from West Lafayette gave me the best advice that I had in the legislature, and that was, if you want to impact education policy, follow the money. And it turns out that they also gave that same advice. He gave that same advice to Bill McCarty, and so both Bill and I had put in for the finance committee after that, because it became obvious to me, of course, that education policy is really done in the budget and in the finance committee. It isn't done in the education committee.
Right.
At least it wasn't at the time. And so I kind of changed where I was going in terms of my areas of expertise. So I did spend a lot of time on healthcare. I spent a lot of time on the environment, but I also spent an enormous amount of time on budget issues. And as soon as there was an opening in finance, I got appointed to finance. As soon as there was an opening in budget, I got appointed to budget, and I was the first woman to serve on budget. I was the first woman to chair the budget committee. Because I don't think anybody had ever told a woman who came to the legislature that you should follow the money, because that's really where the power is.
Right.
And when you hear it described, you always hear when people talk about the Senate Finance Committee, it's not just the Senate Finance Committee. Of course, it's got a new name now. But it was always the powerful Senate Finance Committee.
Yeah.
That was just an adjective that just went along with it. And the same is true of the Budget Committee, which is even more powerful. The Budget Committee meets all year round.
Sure.
And those are closely held positions. I mean, you have to wait for people to die, basically, to get those positions. But to me, that was the best advice I received. But all 3 of those guys were my mentors. They were all intelligent. They were well-spoken, articulate. They were great at the microphone. And so in many ways, they opened doors for me on my legislative career that I don't think I could have done by myself.
Okay, sure. So how did you keep track of the needs and wants of your constituents?
I interacted a lot with my constituents. I really believe in that. I always did what we called third house opportunities on Saturdays. During session, we would meet and people would come. I did a lot of television shows because we have the public television station in Bloomington, public radio. We had a couple of radio stations at the time. At the time, the local newspaper had a reporter who covered the legislature. They don't do that anymore, but at the time, there was a lot of news coverage of what the legislature was doing, and I always had an open door to the press and media. Coming from that world myself as a former newspaper person, I tried to foster relationships there so that I could have a medium really for communicating to and receiving information back from my constituents.
Right.
So
okay.
Plus I kept up as much as I could when we weren't in session, all of my activities in the community. My daughter was still in school. My son was in college for most of the time, and then law school. And but I was still active in things. I went to all the music concerts and all of those things. I did my own grocery shopping and all of those things. So I kept up as much as I could interacting with my constituents. I often started, like if I was checking out at the Kroger's, I would ask the clerk some question about some tax policy we were debating, or
Okay.
Ask about, well, what do you know about PCB disposal and what's going on with that, just to get a feel for what they knew and how they were perceiving what was going on in Indianapolis.
Sure.
So I tried to do that, but I think Bill mentioned this to you, and I feel so strongly about this. Half of our job is legislating as a legislator, is coming up with the laws and, or killing laws that are potential laws that are bad. The other half is communicating with constituents to make sure that they know and understand as much as you can impart upon them on the issues of the day. And I used to tell people, my colleagues who said, oh, I can't vote for that tax increase. I can't vote for that because my constituents. And it's like, no. You've got that backwards. You should, if you cannot learn about an issue, study it, research it, know as much as you can, and make a decision, place your vote, and then go home and explain why, how you did it, and why you did it the way you did, then you shouldn't be here.
Right.
And that two-way communication with your constituents, I think, is just as important as the legislator's part. And I think a lot of legislators, a lot of congressmen for sure, a lot of state legislators forget that, because they get in Indianapolis and it's fun, and you get to go out to dinner, and
Sure.
you get to do all that stuff, have a cocktail after dinner, that kind of stuff. And that's why they're there. And they throw in a couple of bills during the session, but they don't communicate with their constituents. And so, what have you gained? What good have your constituents gotten out of you serving them?
Right.
And so to me, that was a very important thing. I always spoke to schools when I was invited. I often spoke to government classes, high school economics classes, political science classes. I tried to speak to all the fourth grade classes I could because they study state government. Just because I thought that was my job.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned your husband, Bill, a little bit earlier. What was it like serving with Bill McCarty after you guys got married and you're both in the Indiana General Assembly together?
Well, it was the weirdest thing because we were really close friends. The four of us, the Three Musketeers became four, and they took me everywhere.
Yeah.
A lot of the women were afraid to go out after dark.
Okay.
We had a late session and you couldn't go out to dinner or anything because it was dark and if you were by yourself. And so they always included me in everything. Yeah. And we just got to be really close friends, the four of us. And so it never was more than that until all of a sudden it was. And, yeah. And then when we got married in November of 1989, Louie and Mike were in our wedding. They were ushers in our wedding because we were just so close, the four of us. So I was used to serving with him. It didn't change that much, really. Didn't change that much after we were married. I'm trying to think how it might have. Mostly it was how other people reacted to us.
Sure.
We were it's in the national news for a while because we were the only couple there were some House and Senate members in Alaska and I think one other state.
Yeah.
A House member and a Senate member were married. But we were the only ones in the same chamber.
Yeah.
And at the time. And so, yeah, we were in the national news, and so other people around us, some of our colleagues and staff, reacted to us in strange ways. But I don't think it changed us very much.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because we each our districts were different. We have. I can describe my district, but you probably know it. And his is different than his district. His was much more of a blue collar UAW town, much more working people. And then they had that small private university. And my district was much more, faculty and staff. There were something like 6,000, maybe 8,000 now, faculty and staff.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
At IU in my district. So it's a totally different climate. Everybody used to tease me because I would get more mail when we used to get mail, and later more emails than anybody else in the Senate because I always said I have a very noisy district. They're well read and well educated and they participate.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think other legislators had that, I'll say, gift. It sometimes was a gift and sometimes it wasn't.
I bet, yeah.
But our districts are very different. So we just went about our business representing our districts. The hardest part was remembering which weekend we were spending in which city. Because we had Bill's house in Anderson and my house in Bloomington, and sometimes I'd get dressed in Bloomington, and I remember I left gee, I left my beige shoes in Anderson, and,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But those were logistical problems for us. It didn't have anything to do with our jobs.
Right. Do you remember the first bill that you sponsored?
I don't remember if it was the first. I remember the first one I passed.
Okay.
Which had to do with, I was just on the edge of welfare reform. I was just, Bill Clinton hadn't been elected yet. Nobody was talking about welfare reform, but I was doing a little tweaking of some of the AFDC legislation, family dependent children legislation, and I put in this bill, and I got it passed. I was the first author and everything. It was like, oh wow, this is so exciting! My first bill. And the governor vetoed it. and so I was so upset because, it turned out that he misread it and that they misunderstood what I was doing.
Oh,
and
wow.
So I went to the governor's office and explained it, and they said, oh, well, we misunderstood what you were doing. So let's try and fix that. And so, what we found out then is that there's no way in Indiana to reverse a veto.
Oh my gosh.
Once the governor vetoes a bill, he can't take it back. The only thing you can do is override the veto.
Yeah.
Or just reintroduce the bill next year.
Yeah.
Which is what I decided to do.
Yeah.
I decided not to do a veto override. I was a freshman, a Republican governor, Republican majority. It's like, oh no, you're not. You may be earnest, but you're not stupid. So don't even try. So I just reintroduced the bill the next year. But yeah, that was my introduction to the bill process.
What differences did you notice between the House and Senate?
Well, the House is a little sillier.
Okay.
They had way more fun than we did on the floor. They would do things like throw spit wads at people, speakers, and throw rubber bands were a big hit. Yeah, they were shoot rubber bands at whoever was speaking, and they were just more rambunctious over there.
Okay.
We were much more dignified. Some people would say stuffy.
Yeah.
One time in the Senate, I can't remember exactly how this happened, but I think there was an incident with a water gun. One of the Republican women, Virginia Blankenbaker from Indianapolis, brought a water gun to the floor, and she started shooting the guy.
Oh my gosh.
The member who was speaking. And I think she got in trouble for that, because the decorum in the Senate it was beneath our dignity.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. We all thought it was funny, but the President Pro Tem didn't think so. So she got in trouble for that. So the biggest difference was in how we acted on the floor, I think.
Yeah.
I do think that there is a difference between a body that has a 4-year term and a body that has a 2-year term.
Okay.
The House is always running for re-election.
Right.
There's no respite. There's no breathing room. And I do think that has an influence on what they do and what they say sometimes. But yeah, I think it's mostly decorum. I think that's what people would notice the most.
How did you? Yeah.
That and the average age, perhaps.
Oh, okay.
the Senate are a lot of old white men, and the House is much more diverse.
Okay. How did you garner support for your legislation when you served?
Building relationships before you needed to use the relationship was really vital.
Okay.
I made as many friends as I could on the other side of the aisle. I tried to identify those people whose word I could trust. Sometimes they disappointed, but most of the time they would come through. And I got a lot of legislation passed in the minority because I really worked to have those kind of relationships with people.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's vital, especially when you're in the minority. The minority is really different than being in the majority, I think. But from what I've observed, you have to be really prepared, really know your subject, those kinds of things, which I think are obvious. But it was the relationships that I was able to build and the mutual trust that I was able to garner with certain people on the other side of the aisle. But the same is true in the House, too. You have to go... The House would switch back and forth between Democrat leadership and Republican leadership. And so you had to have relationships in both on the Democrat side and the Republican side in the House. Because once you get your bill through the Senate, you still have to go through that whole process in the House. And so you have to have people over there who you trust will work it as hard as you did.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, it's only 1/3 done when you get it out of your own house. You have the second third is you get it in the other house, get it through the other house, and then the third is really conference committee. If it goes to conference committee, which was always my favorite part of the process.
Yeah, sure. How influential would you say party leadership was when it came to passing legislation?
I think it varied on the subject matter, on the political ramifications of the topic. The leader is the president pro tem of the Senate is always very powerful and has gotten more powerful over the years.
Yeah.
But is always powerful because they choose the committee that the bill is assigned to. They choose the committee chairman, so they really choose what bills get heard in committee, or at least have input there if they want to. I always had a great appreciation for Senator Garden because Senator Garden from Columbus was he wasn't. I would say he wasn't a control freak.
Okay.
He gave some. He respected all the members of both caucuses, and he gave us a lot of leeway, particularly committee chairs. So if you could go and convince a committee chair that you really needed a hearing, or can I work with you on this bill? If you don't like the bill, how can I change it? Those kinds of things. He would give a lot of leeway to that committee chair. I found that with Senator Long, followed Senator Garden as pro tem. Senator Long, he kept a tighter rein, I think, on committee chairs. I may be saying that wrong, but I think that's my gut feeling anyway.
Yeah.
I was caucus chair and served with Senator Long, so that I was leader of the Democrat caucus at that time when he was pro tem, at least for part of the time he was pro tem. And he had a much different leadership style than Senator Garten. So I think it varied. When Senator Garten really felt invested in something, he would use his power, his influence. But I think he had a respect for the process and gave more leeway. He gave more leeway to the committees themselves and the committee chairs. At least that's how I felt.
Yeah. Did you ever go against your own party leadership on a bill, or?
Probably. I can't remember one right now, but I probably did.
Okay.
I was a bit of a rebel.
Okay.
Being a leader of a caucus is a very difficult task, because regardless of whether you're serving in the majority or the minority, there are 50 egos. I mean, you're not no one sees themselves as a backbencher forever, you know?
Yeah.
People are there because they are confident in themselves. They believe in themselves. And for the most part, they're all nice people, you know? They're people you would like to have dinner with because they're fun, nice. Or else they wouldn't get elected, right? If they were mean.
Yeah.
And so you've got all those egos. Plus you have the staff egos and staff personnel issues. And then there are all the little policy differences. For instance, when I was leader of the caucus, we had some southern Indiana Democrats who were more conservative than some of the Marion County or some of the Lake County, Porter County colleagues. And so sometimes you'd have these big fights, drag-out fights in your caucus meetings, and it was up to you as the leader of the caucus to bring everybody together and to get them all going in one direction. Sometimes it was impossible, but most of the time we were able to do that. But it takes a lot of energy, a lot of work to bring that group together. Sometimes they don't even like each other, you know. It's because they really are different. Somebody who represents I don't know, Chesterton down by New Albany is totally different than somebody who represents Gary. But they're in the same caucus, and so you've got to find some common ground. How can we have unity as a caucus? How can we present the greatest amount of power that we can muster by unifying our voice? So what is our voice? How can we represent everybody? And that took a lot of energy. It's a very tough job. So I don't envy the pro tems or the speakers because they had to do it even on a bigger scale.
Yeah, sure.
It's tough. It's a tough job. Bill was the assistant leader for several years, and then I became assistant leader at some point in there, and then I became leader in the last 2 years I was there.
Yeah, okay. What were the interactions like between Democrats and Republicans when you served?
Actually, they were very good. They were better than I expected. relationships, as I mentioned, I think are the most important thing in the process. And so we really worked at giving ourselves opportunities to get to know each other and to spend time with each other, learn about families and, those kinds of things. So people would have dinners. A chairman of the committee might have a dinner for all his committee members, and then give each one a chance to speak a few words of, like, something funny, an anecdote, or something about your family or something. And so there were several committees that did that. We did these spaghetti dinners that I know, but Bill, I won't bore you with that, but Bill mentioned it to you already, for the backbenchers, so that everybody would get to know each other. Senator Pease and Senator Swords on the Republican side would invite 4 or 5 Republicans, and I would invite 4 or 5 Democrats, and we would all get together at Senator Swords' condo, and Ed Pease and I would cook. And people would bring their guitars, and we'd sing, and it was just fun. Lots of fun. No lobbyists, nobody there but members. And it's amazing what those little efforts can do later on when you need a friend. And believe me, there are many times when you need a friend.
Yeah, sure. How did your legislative service affect your family life?
Oh, it was tough. I couldn't have served without my mother. Because I commuted. I drove back and forth between Bloomington and Indianapolis, and sometimes I'd get home so late, the kids would already be in bed, and then I'd leave before they left for school, and but my mom was kind of the rock. Honestly, I don't know how women. No, let me put it another way. I think it's much more difficult for women with children to serve, and I think that's a real barrier for women in running for the legislature because of the schedule, because of the way the calendar is set up, because it's all what should be a full year's worth of work we squish into 4 months, right? And so there are a lot of long days and late nights. And I remember one time we had I don't know if it was a special session or we were just meeting on Saturday for some reason. Maybe the budget or something. I can't remember. There was some reason we were in session on Saturday. My daughter was going to the prom, her first prom. And I was just beside myself that I had missed so many things, little games and stuff. And it was like, I'm not going to miss the prom. I'm going to go home. And and we had an important vote that night. I can't remember what it was going to be. I wish I could remember the details. But, so my caucused. The leader of the caucus stood up and called a caucus, and the Democrats went to caucus. And I jumped in my car, went home to Bloomington, took all the pictures of my daughter getting ready for prom, drove back up, and then they reconvened, and we voted.
Wow.
But I do think that those responsibilities are felt more by the women in the legislature than by the men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sounds like it's pretty complicated to be able to have that balance with being in the General Assembly and taking care of your family, and especially if your kids are relying on you. So
yeah, I think it's why so many of the women wait until their children are grown.
Yeah.
Before they join, which has an impact on what they're able to accomplish, because seniority is so important in the legislature.
Sure.
and in terms of chairmanships, positions, that you, committee assignments, those kinds of things. Seniority is very important. And they don't have time to achieve the seniority because they start much later than men do.
Yeah.
That's not always true. I'm generalizing, but I think it does have an impact. And so some of the women, many of the women are older when they first get elected.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And all of that would change, of course, if half of the legislature were women in the first place. The rules would change to accommodate that.
Right.
Someday.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm doing everything I can to make that happen.
Yeah. Have you seen an increase in women coming to the General Assembly at a younger age, or is it pretty much the same from when you left?
No, there are younger women. There are younger members, period.
Yeah.
And we went through a period where there were a lot of women being elected, and I think we got up to, I don't know, maybe a quarter of the members in the House were women at one point. And then it started to slack off again.
Okay.
And I don't know what it is this minute, but, and, with gerrymandered districts, I don't know how many women we can get elected, but it's at least new women.
Yeah.
It's a tough life for women, especially women with families.
Mm-hmm. Sure. What would you say was the most controversial legislative issue during your time in the Assembly?
Oh, so many. Well, there were seat belts.
Okay.
Anything to do with cigarettes. I carried with Senator Miller the smoke-free zones in public buildings, etc. That you would have thought we were trying to kill people with our legislation. And actually, we were trying to protect them. But,
right.
So, let's see, seatbelts, tobacco, all of the gaming legislation was very time-consuming. There was a lot of controversy about the gaming, whether it was the lottery, then horse racing, then casinos, riverboats, now casinos. Let's see. For me personally, the legislation that was the most difficult were bills restricting women's reproductive health.
Okay.
It was, I was always the woman in the Senate that everybody turned to carry the banner to try to defeat those bills, and I was so often outnumbered, and I was so moved by the women whose stories I've heard, and my own life has been touched by some of those issues, and some of the people who would carry the legislation who didn't understand the whole idea of conception and reproduction, and I mean, they get so many things wrong. It was like, oh my God, you all need a health class, and it was really difficult for me. And now, it's all coming up again. It's like I started working on women's reproductive rights, or women's rights, actually, because it included economic equity and credit and those kinds of things in the early 70s. So I feel, in a way, like some of my life's work is melting away before now, because we seem to be going backwards in some of those areas. And every time I speak to a group, I try to talk to young women about, I lived in a time when you had to have a man co-sign so you could buy a car. You had to have your husband's permission to take birth control pills.
Wow.
I lived in a time when women had to go to Mexico, and they might or might not get back with all their parts in order to stop a pregnancy. And so I try to tell them that now women my age who fought those battles are really old and tired.
Right.
And now it's your turn. You have to be vigilant. You have to get out there. You have to, where are your walking shoes? Where are your signs? Where is your anger about these things? Because things like access to contraception and insurance coverage for birth control and reproductive health measures, those kinds of things can be taken away with just the signing of the governor's name on a bill. It can disappear, and it's so for me, I think that one was the toughest one. I carried some legislation with Senator Pease, who was from Terre Haute, and our districts were side by side for a few years anyway. And we carried this Wetlands Protection Act, and it took us several years to get it passed, and we did get it passed, and they just tried to repeal it in this last legislative session. But at the time, farmers were very much against it, and I got a lot of threats, phone calls and things at my house, and had to have the state police come and take my kids to school and things like that. So for me, that was very controversial.
Okay, yeah.
It really hit home. People would call and yell at my mother and stuff, and she would cry.
Yikes.
Oh, it was just awful. But anyway, so yeah, there have been a few issues. Of course, LGBTQ issues. I was kind of in the forefront of that. I have a huge LGBTQ population here in this district, so I was always in front of that, which put me out there on some very controversial issues. I had to have the state police. The state police insisted that they escort me to speak at a Planned Parenthood rally out on the steps because there were anti-abortion people across the street, and they were worried that I'd get shot. I mean, stuff like that. It's like you don't even think about it, and it's like, my gosh, all these people out here who are rallying and speaking, they don't have the state police protecting them.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah,
and they are all here standing bravely to protect their rights and the rights of their daughters. And it's there were times when I wondered, what in the world am I doing here? There must be something else I could be doing with my time. So anyway, I'm off track again. I'm sorry.
No, that's good. I mean, all this information, is useful for understanding your story. So let's see. I'm going to go into some specific questions based on some of the research I did. You had mentioned earlier about your work on women's productive rights and reproductive rights and everything. Thinking about the abortion debate, I know that there were some articles that was talking about your involvement in that debate. How has that debate how did that debate evolve during your legislative career when you first joined the General Assembly versus when you're about to leave? Was it about the same, or did it change over time?
I guess it was about the same. I think toward the end of my service, the legislators themselves, many of the newer legislators were getting more and more militant about their more resolved to ignore the Roe v. Wade and other court cases that were relevant. And so there were more bills introduced, perhaps. Coming from California, I was kind of shocked that was an issue again.
Yeah.
But I learned to live with the role. I created for myself. I chose to be outspoken. I used to have people come up to me all the time and say, "Oh, I wish I could speak out on that. I agree with your position on that. But, in my district, I can't," which always drove me crazy. But so it just became apparent that I was it. There were a couple other people later. Senator Talion from Porter County. She became pretty outspoken. Jean Breaux from Indianapolis was always willing to get up and speak on the issue. So it wasn't totally lonely. But once Senator Mahern, Senator McCarty left the legislature, it was lonely there for a while. I'll say that. So I think the debate changed because there were more attacks and people were more resolved to more vitriolic. About the issue, instead of trying to understand that there are other positions on it. Forcing a religious position on when life begins on all of us, because that's what you believe, is probably not good public policy. But but that's So anyway, I continue to worry about where we're going. Now Senator Talion's retiring from the Senate, and I don't know who's going to speak up.
Okay. Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you were the first one to lead and serve on the State Budget Committee. I also read that you were the first woman elected Democrat leader by the Senate Democrat Caucus.
I think I was the first woman to lead any caucus.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think I still am.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did that come about? Describe what was going on at the time.
Well, our caucus, half of our caucus decided that we needed a change, and I was the assistant leader.
Okay.
I also felt like we needed a change, and I felt like we needed to be a little more aggressive in our recruitment of candidates and in our fundraising for campaigns. That we need to be a little less. Well, there are two ways to get along in the Senate when you're in the minority. You can be kind of go along with things because we're in the minority and maybe you throw us a bone. Or you can be aggressive, use the press to your advantage, and not take any BS from the other side.
Yeah.
And that I was more in that camp. And I ran for leader once, and we lost by one vote because somebody changed their vote on me in the last few minutes.
Ooh, okay.
Pardon?
I was just saying, I was like, wow, yeah.
Yeah. And then the next time we elected leaders, I ran again, and this time I had the votes. So that's how it came about.
Yeah, interesting. All right. Tell me a little bit about your work with the Indiana Commission for Women.
Yeah, I carried the bill to create the Commission for Women with Senator Becky Skillman from Bedford, and then both Becky and I were appointed to it. I served on it for several years. I was a little disappointed. You know, I come from a life experience of activism, and this was an agency of state government, and so whomever the governor was got to figure out what the policy would be, and then the commission would implement whatever policy. I thought that the commission should be doing more, and I tried to a little more outspoken. I really wanted them to take positions on legislation and things like that, and so it was a little disappointing, but at least we had one, you know.
Yeah.
Almost every other state in the country had one, and we were one of the last states to do it. So yeah, it was kind of combined for a while with the Civil Rights Commission, which really has a different role and different goals. So I was a little disappointed in that, and I still think they could be doing more. They give out awards and those kinds of things, so there's recognition for women who are achieving things in the state, and that's great. Good. You know, we need to do that. But I guess as part of state government, it must be very difficult to step out of line of whatever the governor's line happens to be.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, but we did some work. We did something I was really interested in was the salary disparity amongst faculty members.
Okay.
At the universities, state universities, where women were paid less than their male counterparts.
Right.
Faculty and administrators particularly. So we collected some of that information. I don't know whatever happened with that information, but we collected it, and hopefully we embarrassed some of the universities into to making some changes. Let's see, what else? That's the thing I remember the most from my personal work.
Yeah, okay.
I invested in that.
I also saw that you worked on a program called the Indiana Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP. Could you talk a little bit about that as well?
That was my best bill.
Yeah, okay. There we go. So.
Yeah. Before the federal government passed Children's Health Insurance Program, Indiana, about 2 years before, passed the Children's Health Insurance Program, which I authored, worked really hard on it with the Hospital Association and the Medical Association, particularly the American Academy of Pediatricians, and then got a Republican, Steve Johnson, to help with the bill. He was a great help to me. He really believed in it. and we got it passed. It took us a couple of years, but we finally got it passed. And Indiana was one of the first states to do a children's health insurance program, which provides health care to all children in Indiana. We were the first state to cover mental health as part of the coverage for children's health insurance. So as a result, Steve and I and our house sponsor, Charlie Brown, from Gary, received national awards for our work on that bill.
Yeah.
And still to this day, I walk on the street and I'll have somebody come up to me and thank me because their child had a serious illness or disease or injury, and they were able to receive coverage under CHIP, and it touches me.
Wow. Yeah, I bet. That's amazing.
So anyway, that's probably, out of the hundreds of bills I carried over the years, that's probably the one that means the most to me and to the people of Indiana.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. I know early on in our conversation you talked about your work with sort of environmental legislation. I read several times about legislation dealing with voluntary environmental cleanups.
Oh, a national award winner, another one.
Yeah.
Actually, the idea was not original. The idea came to me from business people who felt like there was some remediation work that they could do on their properties, but they didn't want to do it without some kind of protection from the EPA or IDEM.
Yeah.
So they wanted to do it voluntarily, and wasn't there a way we could do that? So I worked really hard to come up with the right language to accommodate all the federal laws and the state statutes and regulations, so that we found this little sliver of opportunity, and we wrote the bill around that. And I got Senator Bev Gard, who may have been the chair of the environmental committee at that time, to do it with me. And it allowed a company that had a spill or did something or perhaps acquired property that like underground storage tanks or something like that on the property that may have leaked,
Mm-hmm.
allowed them to remediate it without all the legal problems and penalties and fines that would be imposed upon them by the EPA.
Okay. Yeah.
So if they acted before EPA issued some kind of the word has escaped me, but some kind of like a document, saying that you have to remediate this. If they started the remediation process themselves and they could get the IDEM to approve the remediation process, the plan for remediation, that they could go ahead and do it, and any IDEM or EPA action against them would be withheld until the remediation was complete within a certain time period.
Okay. Yeah.
And so that bill was submitted, I think, by IDEM to the National Conference of State Legislators, and it won an award for innovation.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
That was fun. That was fun to work on.
So, shifting gears to towards some big picture, sort of reflective questions now. Why did you decide to leave the Indiana General Assembly?
In May of 2012, John Gregg was running for governor on the Democrat ticket, and he asked me in May to run with him as his lieutenant governor.
Oh, okay.
And so I couldn't, and my term was up in 2012, and so I had to resign. Well, I didn't have to resign, but I did resign at that time so that they could have a senator in place, because I figured I'd be campaigning full time. So I accepted his invitation and I ran for lieutenant governor.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. All right.
It was time. I had served for 28 years, and I had reached the pinnacle of everything I could do in the legislature, because I was the caucus leader. I had chaired the budget committee. There weren't very many other things that a Democrat could do in the legislature. Plus, after 28 years, what I noticed is that the issues never really totally get resolved. They keep coming back in perhaps a different name or a different form. But it's the same arguments, the same issues, the same debates. And so it was like, I need to have a different view. I love state government. I love it. I had lots of opportunities to run for Congress over the years. And I chose not to because I really love state government. I love the issues.
Yeah.
I love that whole process. But it was time for me to look at it from another viewpoint. And I thought that running for lieutenant governor would give me that opportunity. I had taken a stab at running for governor in 2003. And there was, I had to drop out because it's a long story, but Governor O'Bannon was not running for re-election, and the Lieutenant Governor Kernan was not going to run for governor, and so it was an open seat. So I decided to run. And at the end of 2003, Governor O'Bannon died, and Lieutenant Governor Kernan became governor for a few months. And by the end of by October, he changed his mind and decided he was going to run for governor. So I had to drop out.
Yeah.
So what that experience showed me was that I think I'd be a good governor.
Yeah.
I thought it would be, being lieutenant governor would give me an opportunity to learn more about state government from a different perspective than through the legislature.
Sure.
And it was time for me to learn new things. I didn't want to move away from state government necessarily, but I wanted to learn it from a different place. And so it was the right time. And we came very close to winning, and we ran a decent campaign. So John and I are friends, and we talk fairly often, and I was happy to be his running mate.
Yeah.
And it was a great experience. Running statewide was a really great experience.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So how would you summarize your time overall as a state legislator?
I loved it. I loved every minute of it, even when I didn't. Even when I'm frustrated and when my heart was broken, and when and I had some very emotional days, issues those kinds of things, but it still filled me up. Every day was something new, a new opportunity, a new person to meet. And so for 28 years, it filled me to the brim. And I don't think you can ask for more than that from a job or a position. I love the legislative process. I really do. My favorite thing in the world, and why I like conference committees so much, is that you put everybody in a room, people of diverse opinions, people fighting for you, people fighting against you, and you try to find that magic compromise so that you can put the votes together to get a conference committee report approved.
Yeah.
It's the one time when the minority is on a level playing field with the majority, because the conferees, there are 4 of us, one from each caucus, and all 4 have to approve of the conference committee report. Now, there are ways to get around that, and the leadership occasionally would yank us off and put Republicans on. But for the most part, they held true to the real reason for conference committees, and we would work it out.
Yeah.
And it's a great process. Sometimes people were sneaky and got things in there that they probably shouldn't have, and to tell you the truth, I probably did that once or twice myself. But the important thing is that we were on a level playing field with our Republican counterparts, and they had to work with us, and we had to work with them, and we figured out compromise. So my favorite thing in the legislature was getting a committee room and inviting all the stakeholders into it and saying, okay, this bill's going to pass. So what do we need to do to fix it so that we get enough votes to make it pass, or so that your constituents and your constituents are happy with it? And it's amazing how much you can get accomplished if you're willing to compromise, and if you are also willing to share the glory. And I do think women are better at that than men.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
Women are much more, at least my experience in the Senate, has been that the women members were much more driven to negotiate, compromise, and then share the glory.
Okay.
Than our male colleagues.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite story from your time as a legislator?
Oh gosh, I've told you so many already.
Any other stories? Yes, or that's fine if you don't. But
well, let's see. One of my favorite days was the day that Bill and I got married in the rotunda at the State House. And,
oh wow!
And Lieutenant Governor Frank O'Bannon married us, and Senators Mike Gary and Louis Mahern were in the wedding, along with Christina and Jason, our children, and all our colleagues were there, and the governor, and all kinds of people came, and it was a beautiful day, except for the TV stations who thought they had to cover it.
Yeah.
They kept sticking their cameras in our faces.
Oh my gosh.
And in the middle of the ceremony, you could hear the cameras whirring, that noise. It's like, stop it.
Wow. Like a royal wedding or something, yeah.
But that was a pretty special day.
Yeah.
So, was your question about a special highlight, or?
Yeah, that answer, that's interesting. Yeah, it's a good story. Let's see. What lessons did you learn from your time in the General Assembly?
Oh, one of the most important ones. Let me get my phone over. One of the most important ones is that compromise in a legislative process, whether it's the legislature or Congress or city council or school board, that compromise is a good thing. Compromise is a good word. I often, in my self-confidence, would introduce a bill that I thought was perfect. This is perfect.
Yeah.
And it's going to make perfect law. But by the time it went through the process, and I heard from people of differing viewpoints, and we made changes to accommodate some of those viewpoints, the bill became better and better as it went through the process. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes it gets worse and worse, and you just want to say, get rid of that. I'm not even going to call that bill. But most of the time, this whole process of compromise, of negotiating, of listening to people, and sharing. If you have a shared goal, getting there, you may have different ways of getting to that shared goal. And if you can figure out ways to compromise on that process so that you can reach that shared goal together, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It's and how many times in your life, whether it's with a spouse or a work colleague or whatever, you find yourself in a similar situation where you disagree on something. And so do you just stay in this space of disagreement, or do you figure out, well, how can we turn this into win-win?
Right.
How can we compromise so that we both don't get everything we wanted, but we each get something. And I have found that that's a precious lesson to learn. And unfortunately, people getting elected these days to whatever legislative body think compromise is a bad word. That somehow compromise is compromising your principles, or compromising, or somehow it's less than that you have to win and you have to lose, rather than trying to find a place where you can all win. And I think that we're losing that in legislative bodies these days, and it's really a shame, because I don't think it's going to work very well.
Yeah, it seems like that has been a major factor in sort of increasing polarization that people keep talking about. So I've heard a lot of former legislators reiterate that from, whether Republican or Democrat. A lot of them feel that things are not nearly as easy as they were in terms of being able to compromise and work together. So
well, it's a bad word,
Yeah.
If I'm right, then and if I compromise, then I'm giving in. I'm weak.
Yeah.
I'm that's a weak position, and it's not at all. It's just the opposite. There's strength in bringing people together and making sure that everyone gets something out from what you're negotiating. It's just, I don't know. That's what I always loved the most about the legislature and the legislative process, and I'm sorry to see it going away.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any regrets as a former legislator?
Probably too many to count.
Yeah.
Do I sound like Frank Sinatra?
That's par for the course.
I've had a few.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I probably stepped on a few toes.
Okay.
In my days. But you have to be willing to be assertive to get anywhere. And when men are assertive, it's a good thing. When women are assertive, they say bad things about us. But if I wanted to fight for something, I fought for it, and I refused to. I refused to take a back seat.
Yeah.
I can remember a budget committee. Well, they were conferees on the budget committee on the budget bill, which were usually the 4 members of the budget committee, and so I was a member. But there was a conference committee that had an informal meeting and didn't invite me.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay.
And I found out about it, and I crashed it. Just walked in and said, "Oh, sorry, I'm sorry I'm late." And I just pulled up a chair, and nobody said anything. It's like, okay, she's here now. But so I probably hurt some feelings or stepped on some toes, but that wasn't my job. My job wasn't to be the nicest person in the legislature, or the sweetest person. My job was to represent my 110,000 people to the best of my ability, and I tried to do that.
Yeah.
So, but girls are taught to be nice and sweet, and so it goes against your grain to be tough, and so that's something I had to learn, and I did it.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah, when working in government, you have to, especially in a General Assembly type situation, you have to develop a certain way of doing things if you want to actually get something done, I suppose. So. Yeah, for sure. Let's see. Do you have a proudest moment from your service?
There were many of those too. When I worked really hard, like years, on some piece of legislation and it passed, that always made me very proud. Sometimes it was the little tiny things, like winning a debate in a conference committee or in a committee hearing, being able to answer a question that a colleague thought they were going to trip you up, and those kinds of things are small victories. But when you're in the minority, those small victories are important because they keep your spirit up, they keep your energy going. So those were important. I had some big moments too. I was very proud to be the lieutenant governor candidate.
Yeah.
I was very proud to represent our caucus when I was caucus leader. I was very proud to chair the budget committee, and I think I did a good job at that. So there were a lot of moments that I can be proud of, but I hope I was a good mentor to particularly other women getting elected to both the House and the Senate.
Right.
Tried very hard to be a place where they could come and talk, not necessarily ask for advice, but just get something off their chest if they wanted to. I tried to be an open door for everyone in my caucus, but particularly for the women in the House. And whenever a new woman was elected over in the House, I tried to give them a call and say, look, my door's always open. There'll be days when you're so frustrated you want to kill people. Come over and talk to me, because I think it'll help. And so I tried to be a mentor for other women, because I didn't have that when I first came.
Yeah, sure.
And so I had to find my mentors where I could.
Right, no, definitely.
And so I tried to create that environment. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud that I was courageous enough, brave enough to take on controversial issues that other people couldn't or wouldn't. And I'd do it again if somebody asked me to.
Yeah. what advice would you give to future legislators or even current legislators?
Oh, current legislators. For future legislators, and this is advice I do give to them when I'm talking to them, find an issue, find a topic, and gain expertise in that topic. Research it, study it, have a conversational relationship with it, so that you become an expert on something.
Yeah.
On something. You can have a working knowledge of lots of issues, and in the legislature you do, because we're, an inch deep and a mile wide in terms of what issues we know about. But have one that you know more about than anybody else, because you will find that people will start to respect you. So that would be rule number one. People will start to depend on you because they're taking on other issues, right? So they will start to depend on you for information. And number two is always tell the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Don't hedge your bets. Don't lie. Don't, always tell the truth and be polite. Be courteous. Take even if they're not courteous to you, which will happen. Always be courteous and respectful of each other, because remember, every person there was elected by constituents.
Yeah.
And so in the scheme of things, regardless of how many titles they have after their name or what committees they serve on or how long they've been there, in the scheme of things, you are just as important as they are, and vice versa. So don't ever look down your nose at somebody because maybe their grammar isn't right, or maybe they don't have a college degree, or whatever. Because every person brings something new to the table. Mm-hmm. Every person has their own life experience that they can bring to the table. And so you have to be open to listening and respecting. You don't have to agree, I'm not saying that, but respect and listen to that person, because they're bringing to the table the thoughts of 60,000 or 120,000 constituents. And they're there to do their job. And so, they deserve your respect.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. And if you respect everybody and try to find something you like about everybody, which was always something I tried to do. So I can tell you something good about almost everybody in the legislature.
Yeah, okay.
Something nice. Then focus on that, and then hopefully they'll try to find something good about you.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Yeah, makes sense, especially if you want to be successful and deal with lots of different people. So.
Yeah, and you do.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. What, in your opinion, is the most important work of the Indiana General Assembly?
Now or in the past?
I guess, the past and present.
Gosh, there's so many things. And I'm not sure I'm getting at what you're trying to get at, but let me just say I think the most important work is to be that a first branch of government that balances out the other two branches, and that it is your responsibility to, as a legislature, to fund the work of state government. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you have to learn a lot about state government to know what is real and what isn't real. But but I guess the funding of state government, the activities of state government is probably the most important thing. Am I getting at what you're saying, or you want more? You want more philosophical?
No, it was an open-ended question. So yeah, whatever you think is what's important. So. And
maybe that's because of my own experiences, because I followed the money, as one of my mentors said. But it seems to me that everything else grows out of. To me, the budget sets the priorities of the state. The budget speaks in a different kind of language, but it speaks the what's important to the state in terms of public policy, and so the budget is more important than just the dollar amount. It speaks to the priorities, and so that's why I think the budget is so important. But my gosh, there are so many other things. I mean, the access to the ballot and protection of civil rights and not just civil rights, but the rights of human beings.
Yeah.
And the protection of families, the protecting of families and workplaces and workers. And, oh my gosh, I could go on and on. I mean, all those things are responsibilities of the legislature. And to me, that's why it's the most interesting of the three branches of government.
Yeah. What would you say the public does not know about the Indiana General Assembly?
Way more than they should.
Okay.
They should know more. But it's almost impossible these days because the media has with some notable exceptions, has withered away. It's so difficult to figure out what people are doing in the legislature, the state legislature. And right now there's such a focus on federal government, and maybe rightfully so, but in terms of what impacts your life on a day-to-day basis, state legislatures are probably more important than what Congress is up to. So I wish that people were more involved in their state government, but unless you have something, my experience has been that if a person in the public has some dog in the hunt, like if they have a child with a disability or a serious illness, or they live in a rural area and they have no broadband access, or they have a child who's getting ready to go to college, but there's no money to go. Unless they have some personal experience, most people just go along and the legislature functions and we're functioning and my family's functioning, and there's no reason to get involved in that because there are so many other things I'm worried about, paying my bills and keeping my job and sending my kids to school. So the tendency is that unless you have that something that motivates you to force yourself into the process for a personal reason, then most people stay kind of oblivious or above that legislative, the nasty stuff that goes on at the legislature, and that is so unfortunate. And it used to be better because the press, the media, was much more capable of covering it. And now, because of budget cuts and et cetera, there's hardly a press corps there anymore. There aren't local news directors at radio stations. We used to have lots of those. It's really difficult to find the information that the public needs to to follow what's going on.
Yeah, you mentioned something really interesting about sort of the takeover of federal government when it comes to media attention. Do you think that, especially as you went into the 2000s into your service, that less and less people really thought anything about the General Assembly and state government, like it wasn't even on the radar, and they might not even be aware of how much influence it has in their day-to-day life in their state?
I think that's absolutely true. I think people aren't aware of it. When I talk to my high school classes, or even my fourth graders, I talk in different words, but I usually put up a big chart, and I tell them, okay, what kinds of things are you interested in? Like, do you have potholes in do you ride in a school bus to school? Do you participate? Do you have AP classes, for instance, in high school, or do you have? Do you pay? Are you a taxpayer? Mm-hmm. I ask them those questions, and I put up a big chart, and I put federal, state, local, and then when they start talking about issues, like if somebody says police, I say, okay, that's local government. That goes down here. Okay, now what's another issue? Well, there's this, there's that, and I put them up there, and before you know it, the state line is completely full.
Yeah.
And the federal has maybe war and peace.
Yeah, right,
right. And that's about it. They don't even think of themselves as taxpayers.
Yeah.
So you have to remind them, you pay sales tax every time you go buy a new video game or whatever it is kids buy these days. And just seeing it visually, I think, helps people understand how impactful state government is on their lives.
Yes.
It is incredibly important when you figure that it's schools and school funding, it's roads, it's the allocations to local government. So your local government doesn't even function without state government, and they exist because of state government statutes. And you just go on and on. The courts and blah blah blah. They think the courts are local. Well, they're not. They're state, and so is the prosecutor. and so but it's interesting because people don't think about their everyday life in those terms. So, yeah. So it's absolutely true. It's
also then it just makes me think about when it comes to the ways that state government affects the federal government with things like redistricting and gerrymandering. Thinking about that and what the public may or may not know about that role from their own state in the federal process. How influential would you say things like gerrymandering were, or lobbying and just money in politics in general in the General Assembly?
Well, it costs upwards of there were some House races that cost $250,000 now. I told you that my first race was $35,000, which was the highest of anybody at the time. And just to tell you how much money is now involved. Well, where do you think that money comes from? The money comes from a lot of special interests. Those special interests, however, people like to say special interests like there's some dark folks out there somewhere in some cave that are controlling government.
Sure.
But special interests, are like labor unions. You belong to a labor union? Well, some of your dues goes to the political candidates. And do you belong to the Chamber of Commerce? Do you have a business? You belong to the Chamber of Commerce? Well, they're big contributors. And, you go on and on. And the realtors and the teachers and everybody everybody's a special interest. And so it isn't that special interests are bad,
right,
or that money is coming from those special interests that represent all these constituents out there, but it's just too much money.
Yeah.
There should be limits on how much is spent, and I know, we get into First Amendment issues and all of that, but the truth is that there should be some kind of limitations on what we can spend money on. The TV ads that run anymore are so expensive, and they're so awful. They're really evil and have contributed, I think, to the overall public's disdain for, I said that wrong, the public's overall disdain for the Congress and for the legislature. The greatest evil of all is gerrymandering, I think, because it is undermining our democracy in such a way that that it's perverting the democracy. I heard Bill talk a lot about it, so I don't want to repeat what he said, but let me just add for you that one of the jobs of the caucus leader is to recruit candidates to run. It's really difficult to recruit candidates to run in a district that's 70% Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And so the quality of candidates is driven down. The number of contested races is driven down.
Yeah.
Even if you can get people to run, there are a lot of races that go unchallenged completely, which means there is no campaigning. And what happens when there's no campaigning? Well, there's no opportunity for the elected official to meet face to face with their constituents. We have a thing that I don't know if this is statewide or not. I think it is. That the Republican candidates for the legislature don't even go to the candidate forums anymore.
Wow.
They refuse. They won't even go. And so, and the League of Women Voters has this rule that if your opponent doesn't show up, then you don't get to speak either. And so there's no public debate anymore in these races. And I mean, it's just, I can just go on and on about the effects of gerrymandering, and they're negative. And it isn't just for those in the minority. Sure, it's awful to be in the super minority. I've never been there, but I can imagine it would be terrible.
Yeah.
But it isn't just that, and it isn't just the imbalance of Republican ideas and Democrat ideas, and there's no negotiation or compromise anymore. But it's also, why do I even bother to vote if you're unopposed,
mm-hmm.
or if there's some goofball running against you because they couldn't find another candidate? Or you've got $5,000 to spend and your opponent has $100,000 to spend. Why does my vote even matter?
Yeah.
And so what it's done is disenfranchised all these voters out there. And I happen to think that Indiana is slightly Republican. But the truth is, if you add up, Obama won Indiana.
Right.
It's not always all Republican.
Yeah.
And so the legislature should reflect that. And if it did reflect that, for the whole General Assembly, there would be better debate.
Mm-hmm.
There would be debate at the General Assembly level. But also, there would be some accountability for those people who are already serving. They could care less what their constituents think now.
Yeah.
They don't care. They don't care because they're going to get reelected. The only people that they fear, the only real fear they have is from a primary opponent, which forces everybody to be more extreme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the only opponent anymore. I can't even count. They're not. I can't count on one hand No, I could count on one hand. How many contested races there are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's bad for the General Assembly. It's bad for voters. And I don't know when people are going to wake up. Interesting side note. In the 90s, after the 91 redistricting, I started introducing bills to go to a nonpartisan or bipartisan commission, an independent commission. I've tried it a million different ways. Constitutional amendment, statute. I've tried a million different ways. And my partner in doing it was then Republican caucus member Brian Bosma, who later became Speaker of the House, of course. He and I were both in the minority that in a few of those years in the 90s, and we kept introducing this legislation. And we were, I continued even after he stopped supporting it. But it's devastating. It is damaging. It is perverting our democracy in Indiana, and it's so sad to see.
Yeah, it's something that's I think that the general public, I don't think there's me and the general public that really like the idea of gerrymandering. So, they
don't. But nobody thinks about it until it's time for gerrymandering again.
Right.
And then it's too late. Yeah. Like, we should be going right now. We should be changing the law and getting prepared for the 2031 reapportionment.
Yeah.
It sounds like so far away, and people have so many other things to think about that, no one will do it. But the truth is, now is the time we should be planning for how we're going to do redistricting in 2030, and we never do it. So about 2029, they'll start talking about it again.
Mm-hmm. So I guess would you say then that's kind of one of the major things you would want people of Indiana to know about when it comes to how they can influence the Indiana General Assembly, is to sort of be prepared for issues like that ahead of time and not just thinking about it when it comes around every decade?
Well, absolutely. In the case of redistricting,
right?
I mean, because it is, every 10 years. So, yeah. And if you wait till the last minute, it's too late.
Yeah.
So it has to be done. It has to be done now. But that's not the way we do things. So it's going to make it really hard. And the truth is that because the power resides in the legislature to change this process, and because of the supermajorities that control the legislature, it will not be changed unless the people demand it. Mm-hmm. And if the people demand it and insist that there be changes, then they'll make the change. I heard Bill talking to you about license branches. Well, when the majority party is in charge and they're getting paid to run the license branches, nobody's going to change that process until the people demand it.
Right.
And they did. They demanded it. And so, maybe it's time. Maybe it's time now that we've got maps and we're going to get through this next election in 2022, and people will see that the maps haven't fixed anything. Then maybe we all hit the streets, we get our little signs and we say, fix it now. I'm probably too old to do that, but somebody should do that. Because that's the only way it's going to change.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Let's see. Last couple questions. From your experience in Indiana, how has the state changed over time?
I think, you mean the whole state?
Yeah, the whole state of Indiana.
Oh, boy. I think the divisiveness between Republicans and Democrats has gotten down to the communities now.
Okay.
And so I think people are angrier. less less tolerant, less willing to listen to one another. But I think that's national. I don't think that's Indiana,
right, right,
or specifically. I just think that that's the old pendulum has swung in that direction, and hopefully it'll start swinging back.
Yeah. What qualities do Hoosiers still have or hold dear?
A sense of community, neighborhoods, community. Those are words I find particularly applicable in Indiana. Coming from California, where people feel less that sense of community because it's a very transient society. I think the average stay in a house in California is 3 years.
Wow.
Bill and I just moved from a house that we lived in for 43 years.
Yeah.
I don't know, people have a sense of, and maybe this is unique in smaller towns like Bloomington or even smaller. Maybe it isn't the same in Indianapolis and bigger cities, but there is a sense of community that I find endearing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons I love Brown County so much is because they fight with each other, but boy, nobody better say anything bad about Brown County.
Right, yeah.
Or they'll get their shotgun. So I really admire that and I have always loved the fact that I am part of a community like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's I think that's it.
Yeah, great. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have anything that you wanted to mention that we didn't talk about, or?
I don't know what would be left.
Yeah, covered quite a bit. So yeah.
Wow.
No, it was really
You're
good.
You're a very patient man.
Oh well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and do an interview. It was really informative and interesting, and I think it'll be another good project, good interview to add to our website and everything else.